Police Perspective.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Paris Perspective with me, David Coffey. And this week we're going to take a look at the future of jihad following what was a month of upheaval. From the fall of Kabul on August the 15th, the reopening of the Guantanamo trials ahead of the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and here in Paris, the eventual opening of the trials for those suspected of committing the 13th of November 2015 Paris attacks. So it has been a very stressful month for many people when it comes to looking back at the past, present, and what could be the future of international jihad. Now, in the studio with me today to take a look at what lies ahead of us in the future and the future of international jihad, I am joined by Wassim Nasr, who is a broadcaster, journalist and author, and he joins me here in the studio today. Wassim, it's great to have you here on Paris Perspective.
Thank you.
So first, you are indeed a specialist in radical movements. Well, following the fall of Kabul, you listen in on the chatter on the internet that comes from these jihadist circles. What was the chatter since the fall of Kabul on the 15th of August? Many said that a lot of the movements were emboldened, that this was the work of God and they were ready now to fight.
Well, actually, movements who belong to Al-Qaeda or sympathizers of Al-Qaeda were emboldened, as you say, because they think that this is the proof that through patience, through armed jihad, but also through negotiations, they can achieve what they want. So they they brought back to life the Islamic Emirate, knowing that all affiliates of Al-Qaeda itself and Al-Qaeda Central have an allegiance to the Islamic Emirate of the Taliban. So they were emboldened, and in comparison with Islamic State sympathizers, for example, they assume that the fact that the Taliban took back Kabul is a sign of God. Mm-hmm. Meaning, in comparison with the Islamic State, who lost its territorial caliphate in the Levant, and its leaders were killed by the coalition. Since Al-Qaeda, since day one of the creation of this caliphate in 2014, they consider it illegitimate. Myself, I got to ask a few questions to a prominent leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabic Peninsula, and he was first to tell me since 2014 they are illegitimate, and Baghdadi at the time is an imposter. Mm-hmm. So Al-Qaeda is happy, the Islamic State isn't happy.
Isn't happy. Now, you have a broadcast that is going out on France Info and France 24 at the moment called Pas de Quartier. And this really looks into working class neighborhoods here across France. This one question that one asks when looking at this program, it's about the youth, the disenfranchised youth here in France. What have you discovered, especially now that these trials with Abdeslam have opened here in Paris, looking at Abdeslam being the only commando that survived those attacks, that didn't die in those attacks, who is now in court here in Paris. The people in the banlieue here, what do they think of his arrival in court and how he has handled himself?
Well, actually, they don't feel a lot concerned. They're not even following those trials. They don't feel concerned at all with those trials. That's what I could sense. On the other hand, of course, we had the media fuss at the beginning, on the first day, and everybody was looking for what's Abdeslam going to say or whatsoever, but it's going to last 9 months. So it could develop depending on what he says or doesn't say. But if we want to make a point of comparison, for example, many people were concerned by the Charlie Hebdo trials. By the cartoons, the Prophet, etc. Here we are talking real about core Islamic State sympathizers. So everybody's not really feeling concerned.
Now, what indeed have you found when you've been out in these, what I noticed, the troubled suburbs of Paris? One big issue has been, since 2015, is really for the government policy to try and tackle extremism in France. Have those policies worked? Has extremism been tackled in France in the last 6 years?
Well, it depends. How do you look at it? If we are talking about disengaging people from violence, it worked in a sense. But when you look at people who are committed or attracted by jihadi ideology or propaganda, and mostly Islamic State sympathizers, they are not at all touched by those kind of measures, and still we are seeing less attacks here in France. We are seeing less attacks, and we are seeing less people putting up plans or crews to commit attacks, and this is because of the work of the state, of course, and because also even if the ideology is still living, but what was happening in 2014, 2015, like the territorial caliphate and being at reach. This caliphate being at reach isn't actually today the case. So it's less appealing. It's less appealing.
So, I mean, in the run-up to 2022 elections here in France, I mean, what you've a kind of a key word or sentiment that you have still evoked since we began our conversation today is they're disengaged. They're not interested. Who exactly is there to represent Muslim youth in the politics of France in the run-up to this election next year?
Well, actually, I don't know, because there's no
core figure.
In France, there's no Muslim vote. Okay, unlike other countries, there's no Muslim vote in France. This is like a myth, the Muslim vote, because Muslims vote either on the right or either on the left of the political spectrum. And if you talk about banlieue, for example, what can be considered as Muslim vote, the majority votes for Mélenchon, which is far left.
Yes.
You see, but at the same time, if you talk about participation or going to the polls, still it is very, very low. So many people don't even bother, don't even go to vote.
And what about the role of this famous Islam de France, or French Islam, that was really kind of this construct of the secular society? Has that made any impact in bringing let's just say, a more mainstream Islam to the country?
Well, no, because the aim ain't political at the beginning. The aim is to try to monitor any extreme appeals through those measures of French Islam, but it didn't work out. Actually, it's still a project that didn't work out, and I don't know even if it's gonna work out. But because, as you know, whenever the states get involved in such issues, usually people don't follow.
Yeah, it's because it's too mainstream. I mean, they need something
because
to fight against.
There's a state behind it.
Yes.
You see, it's when it's .gov, it doesn't work either in France or other places.
And let's look. Let's take ourselves away from the kind of more local issues here in France, but still regarding the Paris attacks in 2015. There were subsequent attacks in France, across Europe. Let's just say in 2021, in the past 5-6 years that have passed, or you can say the last 20 years since 9/11, how has international jihad evolved? I mean, there's been massive state investment all over Europe, all over the world, all over America, in surveillance, security. Even the people now who are on trial here in Paris, they were caught by their telephones, by their networks, and by various texts they were sending. So how has jihad evolved in the past few years?
Well, many things happened in the past 20 years, and as you say, jihad evolved, and legal measures evolved too. So jihadis adapted also their way of doing things to the measures that were taken by respective governments. But if we look at tendencies, okay? If you look at tendencies, since 20 years, still 9/11 is an exception. And the attacks of Paris and the 13th of November are an exception too, if we add maybe also the Brussels attacks, which are done by the same crew actually.
Sure.
And those are exceptions, like putting up crews, sending them to the target countries and make them evolve in those countries and get armed and fabricate explosive and attack their own countries and being themselves Europeans for the 13th of November. This is really an exception.
Yeah.
So today it's very hard to put up crews like this of hardened fighters that are willing to go back to their countries and attack. But the trend is something else. Like the Islamic State achieved what Al-Qaeda used to dream of, meaning incite so many people to take up a terrorist action in their own countries, either citizens, residents, or refugees. You see, this is the trend today. It's less lethal, than big attacks like 9/11 or the 20th of November, even if we can't even compare those two attacks. But still, less casualties, but the political impact is still the same.
Yes, indeed. It's like the ISK attack in Kabul airport there a couple of weeks back. It was a small attack, but with great impact. But the one question as well that I would like to ask is, with the evolution of these things, how are the funding channels working? How are the illicit funding channels, how have they evolved around or to get around these increased surveillance?
They adapted, and the latest, if my memory is good, the latest measures on fundings go back to 2017, I think, where they tried to stop the funding from individuals to get to the Islamic State, for example. And it worked. But you have to know also that jihadi movements, either in attacks here in Europe or on spot on war zones, it doesn't cost much, you know?
Yeah.
It doesn't cost much,
so it's really easy.
So it's really easy to put together something. For example, the attack of Kabul that you mentioned. It's one suicide attacker with an explosive belt. That doesn't cost much. With the number of casualties that we saw, with the panic that it caused, the shooting from the Taliban and from US forces that hired even the score. You see, so there's the psychological impact. But it's a fact. It doesn't cost much. 9/11 costed a lot, but the 13th of November didn't. And you have to know that jihadi movements, they live on microeconomy in the places where they are. So it's small amounts of money that gather and make big amounts that permit them to conduct their operations.
And here's a bit of a curved ball I'm throwing at you, Wassim. The former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair recently said we should brace ourselves for another wave of jihadist attack, and that will be biological, it will not be suicide bombers, it will not be chemical. Does he have a point? Who can tell if it's going to be a biological?
I don't know if he has a point, but actually what I can tell you, it's that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan at the time, and the Islamic State in Iraq a few years back, tried to develop chemical weapons, but very low-tech chemical weapons. With even when they are used, they make very low casualties. But here we are talking about the psychological impact.
Sure.
You see, so they are trying. Of course, they are trying, but they don't have, because you can develop the weapon, but you have to develop also the ability to deliver it. It's not enough to develop it in a lab. And in a very primitive lab, and then it's another thing to put it on a plane and make it work.
And staying on the international theme there, mentioning Tony Blair over in the UK, the former British Prime Minister, but Joe Biden recently announced that there was the declassification of FBI documents regarding 9/11 and the attacks. The main question on everybody's mind was, were the Saudi government in Riyadh behind this? And what has come out is still, well, we have no proof. So was that the end of it?
I think that actually we can suspect that Al-Qaeda had sympathizers inside, not the government, but the establishment, the Saudi establishment, and funders. But that doesn't make the government responsible. There was no government policy to back Al-Qaeda. I can remind you that bin Laden himself was stripped of his nationality and kicked out of. He wasn't able to go back to the country, and the Saudis are like number one partners of the Americans in anti-terror operation, either in funding those operations. They are number one funder, even on the religious level. All the fatwas against jihadis, but they came out of Saudi Arabia. So it is easy to say that we suspect the Saudi government, but what is factually right is that Al-Qaeda had sympathizers, as other groups had sympathizers in other parts of the world with other governments. But that doesn't make, in my sense, the Saudi government, as a government or as a state, responsible.
There is no smoking gun in the government at Riyadh. Okay, one final question, Wassim, before we go, just bringing it back here to France. What do you believe, no matter what the outcome of the Paris trial here of the accused jihadists, how will the decisions, do you believe, impact the radicalisation of people here in France? And what is France going to get out of this trial in the end?
Well, actually, to sum it up, France or another country or not European or Western democratic countries are doing what the United States didn't want to do actually at the time, by judging terrorists or jihadis in regular courts and not military courts, which will make this process it's a public process, and it's a needed process in a democracy to see that we can judge even terrorists and jihadis as individuals.
Yeah.
And this is, I guess, the most important message of it all. Knowing that the United States didn't do it because, as you said at the beginning, there are the trials for Sheikh Mohammed. It's a military trial.
Yeah.
It's not a regular
different rules.
Yeah, it's not in a regular court. That's on one hand, and on the other hand, we have to remember, since we are talking of about 20 years back, that Western countries, starting the United States and even Israel and European countries and France particularly, are using drones to kill people and operations. So this is extrajudiciary. So when you have the opportunity to judge those people, well, in my humble opinion, as a democracy, you should.
Okay. Wassim Nasr, journalist, broadcaster and author, thank you very much for being on Paris Perspective today. And thank you for tuning in to Paris Perspective. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time here on Radio France International.